You know, back in 1637, a single tulip bulb in Amsterdam cost as much as a luxury mansion. Literally, a flower. Now, if you think we've somehow gotten smarter since then, well, let's dive into this explainer. If you've been paying any attention to financial news over the last decade, or frankly, the last century, you've probably noticed a pattern, right? Markets boom, everyone seems to be getting incredibly rich, and then, bam, suddenly everything just collapses. It feels unprecedented every single time it happens. But as the classic book Manias, Panics, and Crashes by Aliber, Kindleberger, and Macaulay lays out so perfectly, financial crises, they're not new. They are what they call a hardy perennial. They're a recurring theme in the garden of our global economy, blooming and dying back with remarkable consistency. So today, we're going to dissect exactly how these cycles work, why we keep falling for them, and what actually happens when the music finally stops.
I mean, just think about the contrast here. You've got the towering physical reality of modern skyscrapers sitting right next to the completely digital, intangible promise of Bitcoin. The objects we speculate on are constantly changing. Back in the 1600s, it was those incredibly expensive tulip bulbs. In the 1920s, it was the stock market. And more recently, we've seen it with real estate and crypto. The assets change, the technology changes, but the underlying human and economic mechanics of a mania, those remain exactly the same.
And at the absolute core of all this behavior is a legendary quote by Charles P. Kindleberger. He said, "There is nothing so disturbing to one's well-being and judgment as to see a friend get rich." Just let that sink in for a second. We really like to think of finance as this cold, highly rational realm of mathematics and fundamental analysis. But at the height of a bubble, it's not spreadsheets driving the market. No. It's that agonizing, visceral pain of watching your neighbor buy a brand new sports car with money they made from an investment that you decided to pass on.
So, let's get right into the anatomy of a crisis. To understand how all this builds into a full-blown economic event, we use the framework of the legendary economist Hyman Minsky. Now, Minsky wasn't an economic historian, but his theories provide basically the perfect lens for understanding this boom and bust cycle. His most famous concept is the Financial Instability Hypothesis, and the core idea here is incredibly counterintuitive, but brilliant. Stability is actually destabilizing. Think about it. When times are good and the economy is prospering for a long stretch, investors, businesses, banks, everyone gets confident. And what does confidence lead to? It leads to taking on more debt and engaging in much riskier behavior. The good times literally reward those who adopt fragile financial structures because leverage amplifies returns.
Minsky actually categorized this into three distinct stages of finance. First up, you have hedge finance. This is the healthy stage. Your income easily covers both the interest and the principal of your debt. You're completely safe. But as the boom continues, we start slipping into speculative finance. Now, your income only covers the interest. To pay off the principal, you have to keep rolling over your loans, basically just relying on the fact that banks will keep lending to you. Finally, at the absolute peak of the mania, we enter Ponzi finance. This is the danger zone. At this point, your income cannot even cover the interest on your debt. Think back to the 2008 housing crisis, right? People were getting those ninja loans, no income, no job, no assets. You are completely reliant on borrowing more money or selling your assets at a constantly rising price just to stay afloat.
These three stages end up playing out like a tragic play in 5 acts. This is exactly how a bubble inflates and eventually bursts. The life cycle goes displacement, boom, euphoria, financial distress, and finally, panic and crash. Let's trace it. It always starts innocently enough with a displacement. This is a real, legitimate outside shock to the system. It could be a massive technological shift, like the sudden explosion of the internet in the 90s, or maybe a major policy shift, like financial deregulation. This shock creates genuine, brand new profit opportunities, and people will rightfully get excited. This optimism triggers the boom, which is heavily fueled by a massive expansion of bank credit. Money is cheap, loans are super easy to get, and investment just pours into this exciting new opportunity. But then we cross a threshold. Welcome to Phase 3, Euphoria and Overtrading. This is where the positive feedback loop of rising prices creates an absolute frenzy. At this point, speculation completely detaches from the underlying fundamentals. People aren't buying a house to live in it anymore, or a stock because the company's actually turning a profit. No, they're buying purely because they expect to sell it to someone else for a higher price tomorrow. The classic greater fool theory completely takes over. And honestly, this is exactly when the swindlers and those catch-penny schemes start coming out of the woodwork, because money is just flowing way too freely for anyone to stop and ask hard questions. Which brings us to the psychology of FOMO.
You really have to ask, why do smart, everyday people willingly participate in this madness? It's so incredibly easy to just blame bubbles on greed, but greed is a solitary, selfish desire for wealth, right? Think of Scrooge McDuck swimming all alone in his vault. That is not what drives a mania. What drives a mania is the fear of falling behind. It's a deeply, deeply social phenomenon. It's that gnawing anxiety that your peers are succeeding and you are being left in the dust.
We are literally hardwired for social comparison. We don't just want to be wealthy, we want to keep up with the Joneses. In an era of high wealth inequality, the gap between the rich and everyone else is glaringly obvious. And that makes risky investments start looking a lot less like a gamble, and more like a necessary, high-stakes lottery ticket just to maintain your social standing. I mean, nobody wants to be the only one at the neighborhood barbecue who didn't triple their money on a dog coin. This is also exactly why affinity frauds, like Bernie Madoff's infamous Ponzi scheme, are so devastatingly effective. They exploit that natural trust we have for people within our own social, religious, or community circles. Combine all of this with a media hype machine that heavily focuses on the upward rise and conveniently ignores all the risks, and man, it is no wonder people get completely swept away.
Now for the ultimate crash.
Because eventually, gravity always wins. The psychological high evaporates and turns into sheer terror as we enter phase 4, financial distress. This is the big turning point. The smartest money in the room, the insiders, they realize the market simply cannot go any higher. So they quietly start taking their profits and selling out. Prices stop going up, they just sort of plateau. There's this really uneasy hesitation in the air. People are stretched so tight. And then a signal occurs. It might be a surprise bankruptcy, a weird rumor, or maybe a bank pulling back on a massive loan. Suddenly, the collective realization sets in. There just isn't enough cash in the system for everyone to sell at the top.
Which leads us directly into the final, brutal phase, revulsion. The phrase the authors use here is the door-shut panic. Everyone's stampeding to get through the exit before it violently slams shut. The euphoria completely inverts. Speculators are suddenly desperate to convert their plunging assets back into cold, hard cash. But at the exact same time, lenders feel this revulsion too, so they just stop lending. Credit vanishes overnight, bankruptcies completely skyrocket because all those firms that were relying on Ponzi finance, they can no longer roll over their debts. The bubble hasn't just popped, it has completely imploded. So that leaves us with the ultimate policy dilemma.
The debris is falling. The entire economy is teetering on the edge. So who, if anyone, should step in to stop the bleeding? Governments and central banks face this agonizing dilemma. On one hand, you have the role of the lender of last resort. You can step in, print money, bail out the failing banks, and basically prevent a total economic depression. You provide the public good of stability. Great, right? But on the other hand, doing that creates a massive moral hazard. If investors and banks know for a fact that the government will always bail them out when things go horribly wrong, why would they ever be cautious? Saving the day right now almost guarantees that you are funding an even bigger, much more reckless bubble tomorrow.
So, how do you solve an impossible dilemma? Well, the historical solution is what the authors describe as a necessary sleight of hand. They literally call it the trick. The central bank must eventually act to prevent needless deflation and a total collapse, sure, but they have to maintain a terrifying level of uncertainty while doing it. They have to make the market genuinely doubt if the rescue will arrive in time, or honestly, if it will arrive at all. By leaving the outcome uncertain right up until the very last possible moment, policymakers try to instill a healthy dose of fear into future speculators, hoping against hope to keep the next mania somewhat in check.
Because history tells us, without a shadow of a doubt, that another displacement will happen, and another bubble is going to inflate. It's practically guaranteed. The real question is, when it happens, will you recognize the warning signs? Or will the sight of your friends getting rich simply be too much to bear? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep your eyes open, stay rational, and I'll catch you next time.